Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Mitchell Kent about improving popping sorghum varieties. Popping sorghum is a niche alternative to popcorn with no large holes, a neutral flavor, and smaller kernels. While the tasty snack is growing in popularity, much remains to be learned about the practices that can produce the best popping product. This episode, Mitchell discusses his research on finding the best production practices, commercial varieties, and popping quality traits for this up-and-coming snack time star. Don't forget to listen to the end of the show for our student spotlight. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Today we have Mitchell Kent with us. Mitchell grew up in Central Illinois, where he obtained a bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois in crop sciences. He then moved to Texas, where he obtained a master's and soon-to-be PhD degree from Texas A&M University, working with sorghum breeding and the genetics lab. His research has focused on a wide range of topics, such as specialty sorghums and genomic predictions. Hi Mitchell, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
So happy to have you. So today we are going to be talking about popping sorghum. So to kind of set our stage a little bit, could you tell us about popping sorghum, what it is, what it tastes like, how common it is, how it's different from regular sorghum, and how regular sorghum is used, just any of that. Let's get some background.
Yeah, sure. So anyone that is familiar with popcorn can pretty easily imagine what pop sorghum would be like. It's essentially just a lot smaller, maybe 20% of the size of popcorn. The biggest differences from popcorn is that it doesn't really have the inert flavor that popcorn has. A lot of people don't realize, but popcorn or corn in general actually has a very strong taste. Alternatively, on the flip side, I guess, sorghum doesn't have such a strong flavor and it's very neutral. So whenever you pop it, it doesn't really have a strong flavor and makes it much more amenable to adding flavors such as chocolate or caramel. There's really not a difference between pop sorghum and normal sorghum, grain sorghum, as there is with corn and popcorn. There's some very distinct morphological differences between the kernel types. And I guess for how common it is, specialty sorghums in general are not very common. The last 10 years or so, they've really, the popularity and the frequency of them have really grown. But if you look hard enough, you can certainly find pop sorghum likely in your grocery store.
All right. Good to know. I didn't realize it was that small compared to popcorn. That's it's almost hard to imagine because popcorn's not like huge in the first place. Interesting. Yeah, I had never heard of this before, so I was very pleased to get a chance to talk with you today about it. I am also going to maybe do some hunting and see if I can find some and try it. Sounds really interesting. So you have done a lot of research on popping sorghum in the past, but in today's paper that we are featuring, there were three main goals that you were trying to research here. So can you give us some background on those?
Yeah, so I guess a little bit of the background is whenever I started here at Texas A&M, some of my predecessors had done some genetic studies in pop sorghum. And outside of that, there'd been some kind of processing food science work done in pop sorghum. But there hadn't really been any basic agronomic work done. So I did a bunch of just very basic, how does threshing methods differ? How does moisture content at harvest differ? And through that, I popped a whole bunch of different genotypes or a whole bunch of different hybrids of sorghum. And one thing that we thought was going to be true, which was generally sorghums that have hard kernels or hard seeds would probably pop better. And just anecdotally, I found that that wasn't the case. We took some genotypes that we didn't think would pop at all, and they actually popped quite well. So we were like, okay, so we have to rethink what's going on here because we don't really understand why or what factors play into what makes sorghum or a good sorghum hybrid a good popper. So that was kind of the basic reasoning behind this paper. So what we did was we took about 80 hybrids And we subjected them to NIR, which is a method that basically estimates percent starch, percent ash, percent protein, and other compositional traits. Along with, we also ran all of those hybrids through a kernel hardness machine, which gives us kernel hardness, kernel diameter, and kernel weight. And we first set up to see if we could correlate any of those traits individually to popping performance. And we found some of the traits had an okay correlation, but not really strong enough to be used for indirect selection. And the first thing we noticed with those correlations is that the compositional traits were much more correlated to popping characteristics than the physical traits. The physical traits being kernel diameter, kernel weight, kernel hardness, or test weight. So that was kind of the first big surprise of the paper or of the study. Then we want to go a step further and say, can we build regression models that essentially uses more than one trait at a time to see if we can better predict popping performance? And we found that we actually could quite well. I guess one thing I should point out is that screening hybrids for popping is extremely, not difficult, but time consuming. If I had to estimate how long it would take to screen one hybrid for popping, it may be 30 minutes. And that's because you have to measure, you have to harvest the grain. You then have to measure the moisture content because you want to bring all of your hybrids up to a similar moisture content. So it's a fair comparison. So you have to measure the moisture content. You have to add moisture. You have to wait a few days for it to absorb the moisture. You then have to count out a specified number of seeds or kernels to subject to popping. And then you actually have to go through popping them. Realistically, you should pop them a few times because there's some variability between poppings or, popping machines. So it's quite labor intensive. So using this, being able to use multiple traits to predict popping can really save us a lot of time.
Sure. And so just for my sake as well as the listeners, like, how do you judge if something is a good, popped sorghum thing? Because and maybe I'm just misremembering, but I didn't see a lot of we just tasted it. It seemed like a lot of it was more like the shape or, making sure you didn't have a bunch of unpopped kernels, things like that. So what are you looking for in a good popped sorghum?
Yeah, well, we certainly did do a lot of tasting, but we didn't include that here. So in this paper, we really used 4 metrics. The metrics we used were popping efficiency, which is essentially just the number or the percent of kernels that you subject to popping, how many of them actually popped. So for example, if you subjected 100 kernels to popping and 85 popped, you'd have a popping efficiency of 85. The next trait we used or measure we used was expansion ratio. And that was essentially just, it's a comparison between the initial volume that you subject to popping and the volume after you subject to popping. So if you subject let's say you subject a cup of seed or a cup of kernels to popping, and it after popping is 10 cups, you would then have a 10x expansion ratio. The next trait would be flake size. So this is just the size or the area that a single piece of popped kernel takes. And then the final one was pop density. So what we did was we measured essentially how heavy the kernels were after popping.
And for those last two, are you looking for bigger, smaller, heavier, lighter? What is a good trait in that sense?
Yeah, so generally, it's not a super straightforward answer. Generally, you would want a bigger flake. However, it really depends on the processing, what you do with it. So in popcorn, there's 2 very distinctly defined shapes. There's butterfly and mushroom. And actually, until this paper, the only shape that had been described in sorghum was butterfly. So whenever you go to the movie theaters and you get a big thing of popcorn, generally that's going to be a hybrid that produces butterfly. So the butterfly shape is one that's big, airy. It's kind of fragile. The pieces kind of break. They're not very spherical, or they're not spherical at all. They're kind of elongated. But they make for a nice, like, direct consumption. Whereas the mushroom shape is used for processing, so it's much more amenable to having like chocolate coated onto it. It's not as fragile. It coats kind of nicely into kind of a nice ball. If you've ever had any kind of coated popcorn, it's most likely going to be the mushroom shape.
Okay, so it's going to depend a lot on kind of the end usage of the sorghum?
Yes.
Okay. And then you had mentioned that a lot of sorghum is very amenable to like adding flavors. So do you find that mushroom is typically what you're looking for, or are people just like, nah, I just want this plain, no flavor, no nonsense sorghum as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like I alluded to, we had always speculated that there was mushroom-shaped pop sorghum, but nobody had ever documented it. And I talked to some people in the industry, and they didn't think they weren't sure if it existed. They had never seen it. And in this study, we actually found a couple hybrids that popped a very distinct mushroom shape. So if there's any future work to be done, I think that would certainly be an avenue.
Yeah.
Is trying to improve or even screen for that shape.
Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Mitchell's paper, Assessment of Kernel Characteristics to Predict Cropping Performance in Grain Sorghum, published in Crop Science, will be freely available for the next 2 weeks. If you are a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Let's get back to the show. Oh man, that's so exciting. It's like discovering a new species. That's very exciting. Okay, cool. So then I wanted to loop back a little bit here. So you were looking to see how the different threshing techniques affected the popping process, looking for good popping quality traits, and then trying to kind of take that next step to get some of potentially those commercial candidates. So I was really interested when I was reading about the production methods, because I, as everyone on this podcast knows, do not come from a background in any of this. So I was hoping you could kind of walk me through the different types of methods and like what that actually looks like. Also, just as like a starting point, is it fair if I'm thinking about popping sorghum to just like imagine popcorn kernels but like smaller, or is it like, what should I be picturing for sorghum, and then what does it look like when it's going through these processes?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing is there's a very distinct look between grain corn and popcorn, whereas for sorghum, that's not the case. Like I said, there's really no morphological differences between just a normal hybrid that doesn't pop very well and a normal hybrid that pops really well, at least visually. What I found with that first paper we discussed, there certainly are some, especially compositional differences. But yeah, you asked about the different types of production systems. So kind of like what I alluded to first, the first question I had when it came to pop sorghum is just basic agronomics. How do you even harvest it? At what moisture do you harvest it at? How do you harvest it? We know in popcorn, they don't just use a normal combine. A lot of times they use an ear picker and will thresh the cobs later. There's been a lot of work done in popcorn, and it's pretty well understood that you can really destroy the quality with threshing it wrongly or combining it wrongly. So we expected similar things in pop sorghum, but like I alluded to, sorghum is very different than popcorn, so we weren't really sure. So what we did in this study was that we subjected some genotypes to 5 different threshing methods. So the first was just hand threshing. So this was our control. It's supposed to be absolute no kernel damage. All we did was we took the panicles and essentially rubbed them between our hands. The next one, we used a rubber belt thresher. This was a thresher that's used very common in threshing, especially like sorghum and soybeans and some other small grains. It was pretty small, it's a research piece of equipment. The next one was we just used an old John Deere combine, grain combine. This would be the same, just one that the guys are, in this part of Texas would use to actually thresh grain sorghum. The next one we used was a small, it's a plot research combine. It's very similar to the mechanics pretty similar to a normal combine. But we had some adjustments made to make it a little bit more abrasive than just a normal combine. And then the last method we used was a metal brush. It's not necessarily a thresher, it's more used to clean seed. But it's essentially a method that uses brushes along like a metal concave to remove glooms and other debris within the seed. So what we found there was that, like we hypothesized, the hand thresh seed had essentially no damage, had the highest performance of popping, and it really went downhill from there. We found that really direct metal to seed or seed to metal, kernel to metal contact can really reduce the popping quality. We found that you can have a hybrid that actually has really great popping quality, but if you thresh it wrong, it really just becomes a horrible popper, even though visually the grain looks the same, after you clean out all the broken kernels and stuff. So visually you can't really tell if it's going to pop very well. But
okay. I have 2 subsequent questions off of that, at least to start. So the first one is, you mentioned the hand threshing of just kind of like rubbing it between your hands. So should I be picturing something like wheat as like a sorghum proxy in like my mental image?
Actually, funny enough, growing up in Central Illinois, I had never seen sorghum until my first day of grad school. They don't really grow it hardly at all in Central Illinois or in the Midwest at all. So I think the best way to describe sorghum is that it looks very similar to corn, especially before it flowers or before corn flowers or puts ears on. It's before it flowers, it's pretty hard to tell the difference between corn and sorghum. But once it starts to flower, it's very clear. So sorghum is, like I said, it looks similar to corn, but it's much shorter. Instead of, corn having an ear halfway down the plant or 2/3 of the way down the plant, sorghum has a big panicle that comes from the top, and that is actually the harvestable piece. That's where the grain is.
Okay. That helps me. I just don't know what I'm supposed to be picturing. So then the second thing that I wanted to touch on is you had mentioned that you can't really tell visually. So do you have a theory on why the popping quality reduces? Is it just internal damage? I mean, it doesn't seem like it's it, dented it or put a hole in it or something where the steam wouldn't work. What is the theory there?
Yeah, that's a good question. We certainly do have some theories. There's really 2 ones that we think. We think that there's probably what happens is that whenever the seed kind of fastly hits something metal, it either tears the pericarp, which is the outer layer of the seed, a very thin, fine layer. It ever so slightly tears that, or it actually causes the starch to crack. Both of them would essentially be leading to moisture or pressure being released. So the way that sorghum and corn pops is that essentially when you warm them up, apply heat to them, pressure builds up, kind of think of it as a balloon. Then eventually it's just too much pressure and it pops. So what we think is that these hairline fractures within the endosperm or small holes in the pericarp is essentially releases the pressure to escape before it builds up high enough for it to pop.
Okay. And then that actually sparked a third additional question. That was actually something you mentioned earlier. Is you mentioned the moisture content and having to like bring that up and then like let it settle. How do you do that?
Yeah, it's really easy. So we have a little device that measures it. It's like a little handheld. It's essentially used for a farmer to go out and test his grain to check if it's ready to be harvestable or not. Essentially, if we have a calculation. So if it reads, let's say 13.4%, we have a little calculation that we basically plug in the moisture content and it tells us how much water to add. So we literally just measure how many ever milliliters of water we need. We pour it into the grain, we shake it up, and we put the lid on. So over a
I
couple
love
of days,
that.
yeah, and over a couple of days, the grain will absorb it, and then you measure it again with the moisture reader just to make sure it's within this acceptable moisture.
Is there a risk of like germination if you add too much, or is it, or
Yeah,
like just leave it long enough? Is that, I mean,
yeah. So the amount of water that you add, it certainly wouldn't germinate.
okay.
I mean, you'd be adding in cups and cups of water,
Okay.
not milliliters. And you'd be leaving it there for a long time.
Okay. Okay. Once again, showing off my non-scientist skills with a lack of scale for popcorn to sorghum, cups to milliliters. I mean, obviously there's large differences there. Okay, so then I think that is really helpful to talk about the threshing. I thought that was super interesting. And then can you tell me more about what you found as far as like the popping quality traits? I know you mentioned the physical might not be as important as the composition. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah. I think that was the biggest surprise to us of how important compositional traits are. To be 100% honest, the reasoning eludes me a little bit. We're not really sure in this. I mentioned some possible future work. I think this would certainly be some future work. One thing that we hypothesized is that protein was negatively correlated with 3 of the traits. As a guess, we kind of as a group discussed this, and we thought that maybe the protein is kind of banding together and maybe not making the starch such a continuous connected piece, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. We had certainly thought about it, but that's a little bit out of our wheelhouse.
Okay. Future research. Exciting
Yeah.
stuff. Okay. And then so the last section of or last goal, I should say, of your 3 goals was to then try and find maybe some potential commercial candidates. So what did you find there?
Yeah. So as we were popping all of these, we essentially found, I'll say this, we found a whole bunch that popped really poorly. We found a bunch that popped pretty well, and then we found a couple that were exceptional. So one thing that we thought, and I guess the future will tell us if this is true, we want to find ones that were yellow seeded. So essentially the options of the ones I popped were anywhere from white to red to brown to yellow. Pretty much all the variations that exist in sorghum grain color. We found that the ones that were especially not white or yellow, the reds, the browns, when they popped, they looked burnt. It's like that color got even darker. And visually, I mean, they tasted fine. There's really no difference between them, but they just looked awful. So we really realized that we had to either go with a white or yellow. And yellow being closest to popcorn, we kind of thought that would probably be the best route to go. And it just so happens that we had a couple hybrids that were yellow and probably, maybe not most importantly, but very importantly, had actually really good agronomics. These were hybrids that we were actually evaluating for agronomics for food, for like a food grade sorghum, even before we screened them for popping. So we found that they were just amazing poppers. So it was kind of a no-brainer to make a release out of them.
Sure. And was there any correlation between like color and popping greatness, or color and mushroom versus butterfly, or is it just kind of across the board?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We thought about that. The work that I had done the experiments weren't really designed to test that. For example, we had out of the roughly 80 in the one paper we discussed, probably in equal amount were red and white, but then there were some other random ones. There was like one that was extremely brown, some that were kind of brown. So, do I think that there's something that exists between color? Maybe. Like I said, there would certainly be some future work, but we were not able to test that.
Ah, okay. No, that is great. I'm just giving you all the research ideas. It's fine.
Yeah. I will say that the couple that we found that were mushroom shaped, were one of the unique colors.
Oh, okay. Interesting. How even more exciting then. It's just a super unique mystery sorghum. I like that.
And if I had to guess, it's most likely just the structure of the starch. But I mean, like I said, it's certainly future research.
Yeah. Oh man, this is super interesting. I'm just thinking like just use the burnt looking ones to like cover in like chocolate, or it'll be fine. It's just chocolate. It's fine. Okay, so I think we've covered most of your results. Is there anything else you wanted to add that I didn't grill you on already?
I don't think so. I think we pretty well covered the work that we did here.
Okay, perfect. Then I know we've also talked a lot about potential future research. So is there anything else that you think is on the horizon for poppy and sorghum? I guess research. Sorry,
Yeah.
I thought I'd have like a better word at the end. No, it's just research.
Yeah. So currently we are not working on any more projects. That's not to say that there won't be projects in the future. We've just kind of shifted our focus a little bit in the lab. And like I alluded to earlier, it's a lot of work to pop. So if you're going to do one of these projects, it's a really serious dedication of time. As far as future projects go, I think we're always open to ideas. I think a cool one that is possible in the future is maybe using genomic prediction to screen or pre-screen popping or hybrids for popping. I think that would be a really helpful way. Maybe even more so because you wouldn't have to measure the grain quality aspects to then predict. You could just genotype stuff.
Yeah. All right. Sounds like there's plenty of room for other researchers to pick up the torch and keep it moving forward. Thank you and your team for what you've already done to lay the groundwork on this. I have 3 questions left for you. So the first one is, if people want to learn more about anything that we've talked about today, where can they go?
Yeah, a pretty quick Google search will yield anything from either the articles that we discussed today, the articles other people have done, or more like just like popular press articles, blogs. If you want to see it, maybe the best way is to go to Google Images or even YouTube. There's quite a few videos on YouTube about how to pop it, and you can get kind of a good perspective of how small it is and kind of other people's thoughts on it.
Sure. Yeah, I know you had sent me a few of your earlier papers in preparation for this, so we will have links to those in our show notes, as well as, of course, your paper. That'll be set free to read for a couple weeks here. And then second question is, if people want to then take the next step and get involved, be it as consumers, farmers, researchers, what can we do for pop sorghum?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing would be just to buy some. Find products that are made with any type of specialty sorghum. As the specialty sorghum market expands, the more demand there is in research. And like I said, most grocery stores, it's likely you could find it. You're probably not going to find a bag of it just popped, looking like the granola aisle. a lot of granolas, well, not a lot. Some granolas will have it
Sure.
in their granolas.
All right. Good tip. And then what is one fun fact that listeners would not know about you if all they had was your research?
Yeah. If I had to pick one, it would probably be that I'm a pretty avid mountain bike rider.
All right. Okay. Do you have like a favorite trail that you mountain bike?
Oh, certainly.
Oh, okay.
Some of the ones back home in Central Illinois are very fun.
Oh, nice. I have never been, as a very timid creature myself. It's probably not great for me, but that's super awesome. Super rad. Actually, final bonus question for you. I forgot to add it to my notes. Do you have a preferred way of enjoying pop sorghum? Do you have like a favorite flavor or preparation technique?
Yeah. I've had a couple ways that were really great. Recently at the Sorghum Improvement Conference of North America up in Dallas, it was back in March. They actually made pop sorghum balls, so just like popcorn, but they were the balls themselves were much smaller, which was nice. I've actually had it also where it was made into like a trail mix with like peanuts and pretzels that was all coated in like a thin caramel coating.
Ooh.
And it was very tasty.
Nice. All right. You heard it here first, everybody. That's the way to go as you foray into pop sorghum. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you coming on to talk with us, help us see all the benefits of this new snack, or well, not that new, but new to a lot of people snack. So thank you so much for all of your research and being on the show.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Student Spotlight, where we highlight the work of graduate and undergraduate society student members. Today, we'll be talking to Paul. Welcome to the show. Can you start us off by introducing yourself and where you're studying?
Yeah, thanks, Abby. I'm a big fan of the show. My name is Paul Tietz. I'm a PhD student and coach of our soil judging team at the University of Idaho.
Wonderful. And what are you currently researching?
Well, Abby, a pretty typical study in earth science usually involves going out into the field, collecting samples, and doing some lab analysis on them to get your data. My project is attempting to predict that lab data for soil samples just based on the wavelengths of light that the soil reflects. This is kind of like remote sensing, but I'm using a handheld device that measures wavelength reflectance in the visible and near infrared portions of the spectrum, 350 to 2500 nanometers. It's called the hyperspectrometer, and I'm using it to predict phosphorus in soils from Lake Tahoe. Phosphorus is important for water quality, of course, so the idea is that with the hyperspectrometer and the right models, you could measure phosphorus in the soil much faster, cheaper, and easier than by doing lab work, and maybe even measure it from a drone or satellite.
Great. And if you could have your dream research project, what would that look like?
I'm really interested in environmental remediation projects, so studying soil contamination or quality at a mineland reclamation site would be really exciting for me. Got to throw in a couple soil pits to get some description in there too.
Sure. Well, if anyone would like to get in touch with Paul about his work, we'll have his contact information in our show notes. Thank you so much for being on the show today, and best wishes on your future studies and career. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. More information can be found in the description below. Thank you.